I'm Ken Moss. I'm the Meyer Professor of Jewish History and the director of the Joyce Z. and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. Over the past few catastrophic months in Israel and in Gaza and in the West Bank, the Greenberg Center has worked to bring to the University of Chicago and to our public a series of social scientists who combine deep and broad knowledge with rigorous analytical scholarship, and will continue to do so. So please do be aware that there'll be further events, maybe 2 more events this academic year, and judging by the seriousness of the problems we're addressing in an ongoing fashion. I'm very pleased and quite grateful that today we will be able to learn from one of Israel's preeminent sociologists, one of the world's preeminent sociologists, Dr. Eva Illouz. Currently, and forgive my French, Eva, directrice d'études at the École de Haute Études in Sciences Sociales. Dr. Illouz is known around the world and in many, many languages for essential sociological works such as, to list just 2, Cold Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism, and her recent The Emotional Life of Populism, How Fear, Disgust, Resentment, and Love Undermine Democracy. She's a columnist for Le Monde, for Der Spiegel, for Haaretz, and among many journals of record. And she is also, in an ongoing fashion, an analyst of Israeli social life and society. Some of the essays that have come out of that ongoing engagement were gathered recently in a German volume, Israel Soziologische Essays. And it's in that capacity that we welcome Dr. Illouz today to help us understand the impacts of the October 7th massacre and the ongoing catastrophic war in Gaza on Israeli society, on the Israeli polity, on Israeli political culture, on Israel's regnant ideologies and deep divides. We're going to begin by asking Dr. Illouz a question, I guess, on the border of methodology and sort of contentful engagement about how you, Dr. Illouz, approach Israeli society as an object of study. But the reason we're going to begin with that question, of course, is because Israeli society is an incredibly fissured and divided and complex social organism, if that's the right word. And so Dr. Illouz and I agree that it might be useful to some of our listeners, I think come from many different kinds of degrees of knowledge. If I were to begin by offering a few points of background, a kind of sketch of Israel's political sociology. So I'll do that, then we'll turn to Dr. Illouz. So a sort of standard political sociological sketch of Israeli society would encompass, I think, at least the following dimensions. Might begin by thinking about Israel as a polity or a citizenry. It's a largely bi-ethnic citizenry, with about 80% of the citizenry identifying as Jewish ethnically and 20% identifying as Israeli-Palestinian ethnically. And this distinction, of course, is more complicated on the ground, but it entails some far-reaching differences in political condition and treatment, as well as ideological outlook. And we might want to add right off the bat that in saying this, giving this statistic, we, of course, exclude, but we'll bring back in, a far larger Palestinian population without citizenship that has been under Israeli rule since 1967 in the occupied territories. Turning back to the Jewish majority in Israel proper, we should add that it's profoundly divided itself along a number of sociologically salient lines. Some 10% plus is made up of religious Zionist or religious nationalist folks, closely identified with the settler movement and its maximalist aims, which include retaining the occupied territories at any cost, and the imposition of a religious nationalist identity across Israeli public life. Some 15% is comprised of the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox world, which seeks to sustain its distinctive anti-modern theology and lifestyle, but which is also moving closer to the Israeli religious right in many respects. The remaining 75% of the Jewish population is sometimes nominally regarded as secular, but in fact, growing parts of it identify recently rather as traditional. And this distinction indexes closely to another meaningful divide in Israeli society, namely the still salient, though much complicated distinction between those Jews whose families are of North African and Middle Eastern background, Mizrahi Jews, and those whose families are of Ashkenazi or East and Central European background. Some 2/3 of self-identified Mizrahi Jews also self-identify as traditional, not secular. And then to these ethnic divides index non-accidentally or significantly to political divides, with a substantial part of self-identifying Mizrahi Jews tending to vote for parties on the right, either nominally secular like the Likud, or religious and right-wing like Shas. And the remaining 40% of Israeli Jews identifying as secular being largely composed of people of Ashkenazi background and making up a kind of centrist or rump left voter bloc. So that's just a kind of a map. We want to add to that there's an intense and sharp bifurcation of the political culture between the rightist bloc and the rest of society, which plays out in all sorts of ways in political communications. There's been a clear strengthening over the last 20 or 30 years by all indices of ethno-nationalist and religiously stringent tendencies in Israeli Jewish society. All of this has happened amidst or alongside a situation which has been in place since 1967, that this is a society entangled with its state's half-century-long rule over the West Bank and and Gaza, and its population of several million Palestinian non-citizens, with a normalization of Israeli Jewish settlement in the West Bank particularly. And then finally, of course, we have in mind two events. An event that began in February or January of 2023, a large-scale, intense, sustained anti-regime mobilization by the non-right of Israeli Jewish society against Netanyahu and his government's efforts to basically centralize power in the hands of the executive and the legislature. And then second, of course, this is a society at war and mobilized for war in the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, and a catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip. So with all that said, we now turn to Professor Illouz. How do you begin to approach such a deeply fractured and divided and complicated society as an object of inquiry?
Thank you so much, dear Kenneth, for inviting me. I want to start with three caveats. The first and perhaps most serious caveat is that I speak from a Jewish Israeli standpoint, which does not mean at all that I'm not critical about what's going on in Israel and about Israel itself. But I want to make clear that although I have tremendous sympathy for the Palestinians and their struggle, my point of view is not detached and abstract, and that it is a point of view that is profoundly preoccupied by the fate of Jews in the world and by the fate of Israelis as well. And I would expect the same and the reverse to be true for Palestinian. So my critique, as it will be heard here, is a critique from within, to use Michael Walzer's beautiful distinction between a critic from outside and a critic from within. That's my first caveat. The second caveat is that I'm not a scholar of Israel. I speak as a sociologist and as a citizen, or more exactly as a citizen who cannot forget she is a sociologist. So I certainly do not have the historical depth of knowledge that Kenneth Mott has here. And my third caveat is that I refer to Arab Israelis, even though some of them prefer to be called Palestinians, and I do this only in order to avoid confusion. And that is the only reason why I do this. So to respond to your question, which I take to mean, how do I, as a sociologist, address or approach the complexity of Israel, which is also the complexity of responding to Israel? I mean, both are not exactly the same. And I would say, I would summarize it by three notions, which are actually sociological notions: ambivalence, contradiction, and complexity. And this is what I would like to talk about to answer your first question. So ambivalence was beautifully developed by the sociologist Neil Smeltzer, who starts from the person who best, I think, developed this notion of ambivalence in reference to the psyche. And it is, of course, Sigmund Freud, who suggested that the child and the later adult who develops the dependency become deeply ambivalent, having hate and love at one and the same time. And also for Freud, there was this pull and push of instincts and norms. So Smeltzer goes on to generalize this view to institutions, which can also give, in his view, a form and even a ritualized form to ambivalence, as for example, when there are conflicting norms, for example, freedom and equality. So I would say that for me, Israel is a deeply ambivalent political entity, at once colonial and native. And that makes it quite difficult often to analyze because you are pushed by the ideological field to be on one side or another, but I insist on this ambivalence. And this ambivalence was best captured by the Polish Marxist writer Isaac Deutscher, who famously said about Israel and the conflict with Palestinians, and I quote him, "A man once jumped from the top floor of a burning house in which many members of his family had already perished. He managed to save his life. But as he was falling, he hit a person standing down below and broke that person's legs and arms. The jumping man had no choice. Yet to the man with the broken limbs, he was the cause of his misfortune. If both behaved rationally, they would not become enemies." So I think it's a beautiful way to capture at least the emergence of Israel. I'm not saying it captures now what is happening, but it captures well, I think, the emergence of Israel. And it reflects, I think, the deep ambivalence of the state of Israel, both as a moral and historical construct that is born from colonialism, that was embedded in colonial enterprises, and yet which was deeply also embedded in a Jewish history, which really gave no choice but create this state. And I think we should account for this ambivalence as opposed to trying to resolve it, as when we take one position, one very clear position in an ideological camp. Let me move to the second notion, which is the notion of contradiction, which, of course, comes from Marxist theory. And the notion of contradiction was one of great contribution of Marxism to the analysis of society. Of course, I mean, they borrowed it also from Hegel, but that's another story. And I think there maybe the most profound insight was that a contradiction does not conflict with the principle of non-contradiction when you examine society. For them, reality was a dialectical process. It was a dialectical deployment of opposites which do not contradict or conflict with the principles of logic. And what I would say is that Israel is the embodiment of such contradiction because it is and it is not a democracy. Let me say first how it is a democracy. It has a population of 20% of Arabs, Israeli Arabs, who are citizens, who enjoy equal health rights and social security, and who enjoy many of the same legal rights as Jews. The press is free, and the freedom of expression is or was until recently at least as respected as it is in countries as the USA. For example, a professor of law, Nadira Shalhu-Karvokian, who is the Lawrence Bill Chair in Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, called very early on the military response of Israel, called it a genocide. And while she was rebuked by the university, she was not submitted to any disciplinary action and even less suspended. On the other hand, John Strauss, a professor of economics at the University of Southern California, who said that to a group of students that he hoped all of Hamas would be killed, was suspended from his job. So this was, and by the way, he was far from being alone on both sides, I think. So freedom of expression is widely exercised, and I would add also that the government is submitted to judicial review. It is not always happy about it, but I would like also to remind you that in 2022, the Justice Secretary of England planned to considerably limit the scope of judicial review in England as well. Opposed to that is an anti-democratic character of Israel. And I would divide this anti-democratic character in two different categories. The first is what I would call a structural democratic deficit. That is, it is structurally embedded in Israel political organization. Let me give you examples of what I mean here. So the fact that there is no constitution, the fact that the basic laws which are supposed to replace the constitution can be changed very easily by a simple majority in the Knesset, by the fact that the legislative and executive branches are very closely intertwined, since government coalitions are formed from the parliament. And of course, I would add, and this is very significant, the fact that there is no separation of state and religion, and that citizenship is mostly, although not exclusively, but it is mostly decided on ethnic and religious terms, which means that Israeli Arabs live in a situation of systemic segregation. And I would even say that the separate but equal doctrine, the infamous separate but equal doctrine, actually applies to them. Their towns are poor, they have less budgets from the government, they cannot access many professions and positions because they have no security clearance, which would depend on them serving in the army. They tend to be more incarcerated. And finally, I would say that there is a strong democratic deficit in something intangible that we can call a democratic culture. And the reason why the democratic culture is not quite what it should be or could be is because of what I call securitism. Now, let me say a few words about securitism because it's a very important notion to understand Israel. It is with no small historical irony that the early Zionists chose as a land for their national project a small territory tucked in a large area dominated by Arabs and Muslims, none of whom had a particular reason to welcome a handful of people from Eastern Europe initially backed by a foreign colonial power. And I would like to remind you that in the 1920s, the revisionist Zionist leader Zev Jabotinsky viewed Arabs' opposition to the Jews as a predictable and, in fact, understandable political reaction to colonialism. And so I think in the nascent Zionist consciousness, after the state was created, the Arab came to be associated with the ancestral enemies of Israel, and the view that they want to drive us into the sea combined all in one the reality of Arab anti-colonial hostility with the plots and characters of the Jewish history and unconscious. And this is why we may say that Israel is not a democracy like others, because of its geography, because of its inner vulnerability. It was compelled to become a securitist democracy, perhaps with no equivalent in the world. This means that the state and the citizens are not only concerned with, but constantly and actively mobilized to defend Israel. And survival is the key modus operandi of the country. Institutionally, this means that the army, the police, the secret services play a fundamental role in the daily conduct of the state and of the citizens, and that security becomes a kind of key mental feature of citizens. The reason why this is important is because I think that securitism is actually opposed in some way, and I will go back to this. It is opposed to democracy, and so I will like now to say that there are other parts to what I call a democratic deficits. There are, so this is, I'm sorry, this is what I call a democratic deficits, but there are, the second part is what I would call anti-democratic forces. And by this, I mean things that cannot in any way accommodate themselves with democracy. The occupation of 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967, the degradation of their conditions of lives, the control of their lives, the fact that there are two legal systems, one in the West Bank and one in the Green Line. Israeli settlers are subject to large portions of Israeli law, whereas Palestinians are subject to a combination of Israeli military law and some old local Jordanian laws. Adding to this, of course, the fact that the settlements have given rise to a rather aggressive messianic view of conquest of these territories. Now, the notion of contradiction I'm talking about suggests very simply that society is divided. But I would say that until now, the divisions, the tensions, the contradictions in Israel functioned. The secular could sustain the ultra-Orthodox. The Israeli Arabs accepted their separate but equal status because they do not identify with the state. The Mizrahim, the Jews of Middle Eastern origins, become the descendants of Jews who came from Arab countries, can hate Ashkenazim because of the historical segregation they have submitted them to, but they actually take their orders in the army or in politics. The Supreme Court could safeguard a semblance of democracy while the occupation continued. So I would say contradiction was maintained through a kind of subtle equilibrium, and that these contradictions made Israel a highly dynamic and productive society. I think that Netanyahu completely changed this play of tensions and contradictions. And what happened before October 7th with the judicial reforms, I'm not going to explain what this is. I assume that you know that Netanyahu and his government wanted actually to suppress the only safeguard on democracy, that is the Supreme Court. So what happened before October 7th with the judicial reforms by Bibists and Messianists and ultra-Orthodox who actually wanted to assert a kind of Jewish supremacy and destroy the last democratic safeguard on Israel. And the massive demonstration which followed expressed not only the contradictions, but it expressed also the fact that the contradiction could no longer hold. And they could no longer hold because one group actually decided to change the relationships of power. And I mean by that, this alliance between followers of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Likud, Messianists, extreme right Messianists, and ultra-Orthodox. The third notion I would like to offer is the most difficult to grasp. I was just starting to think about it for this talk, so I'm not sure I have it fully worked out. It's the complexity which comes from system theory. So complex systems, let me just say what a complex system is. A complex system is made of a lot of components which interact with each other in multiple ways by following local rather than predictable and generalizable rules. In complex systems, there is no way to define a priori the various courses of action between the various components and agents of an interaction. And there is a British physicist, Neil Johnson, who says that complexity inheres in phenomena in which there is a large collection of objects which interact with each other. For example, a crowd or a traffic jam are typical examples of a collection of interacting objects. Financial market traders, human cells are also examples of complex systems. And another way to describe complex systems is to say they are sensitive to small, very small changes. They have a large number of variables interacting with each other, and they have non-predictable outcomes. They have a large number of possible outcomes and pathways. Complex systems are thus, by definition, highly volatile and dynamic entities. So I think Israel is not only a highly contradictory society, but also a highly complex one. I would even venture to say that it is the most complex society in the world, by which I do not mean it has the worst problems, not at all. Many societies have worse problems, but it is the most complex one. It is complex because I think one thing, there is a wide variety of social groups, and Kenneth, you described this beautifully in your introduction. There is a very wide variety of social groups living inside without a mechanism to reconcile or transcend this plurality. What do I mean by a mechanism to transcend or reconcile this plurality of groups? I mean two things, for example, and there are probably others, but I could think only of two very clear ones. The first one is the separation of state and religion. In order for the state to claim neutrality, even if that neutrality is not achieved de facto, it doesn't matter. You believe in the state because you believe it is neutral. When the state is clearly separated from religion, and it is attendant to this because there is no universal citizenship. And so because you do not have such mechanisms, state neutrality because of separation of state and religion, and universal citizenship, I think there is no overarching mechanism to regulate the differences. That means, and now I'm going to give you a very short description, a thick description, so to speak, of Israeli society. It means that all groups feel the victims of other social groups. Arabs feel and are victims of Jews. Mizrahi Jews feel and are victims of Ashkenazi control of the economy and culture. Ashkenazim are victims of the one-sided social contract with the ultra-Orthodox. Ashkenazi Democrats feel the victims of the Mizrahi extreme right vote, which has locked them into ever more extremist governments for the last 40 years. The West Bank Palestinians and the settlers actually view each other as the victim of each other, although, of course, the settlers have obviously many more resources and power to inflict on them damage, but still the settlers feel victimized by the Palestinians, whether it's real or imagined. Women are and feel victimized by men as because, for example, ultra-Orthodox parties forbid women to run, a fact that has not yet been challenged by the Supreme Court. And by the way, we saw clearly the very sad outcome of this very strong, I would say, discrimination of women when young women soldiers who had understood an attack was going to happen right before October 7, but they were kind of scornfully dismissed by their superiors for being too young, and I suppose for being just girls who don't understand much. So it is, I think, difficult to find a case where society paid a heavier price for its sexism. The religious feel victimized by the secular, who want to get rid of the religious character of the state. And of course, the secular feel victimized by the religious, who have a tight grip on budgets, on politics, and on the legal system. So you see that this makes for a very complex society with a large amount of groups that are highly fractious and who have hostile relationships with each other, who have multiple forms of hostility, whose relationships, however, cannot be always predicted. So I would say that currently it is very difficult to know what will happen with Israeli society precisely because of this complexity, because its main characteristics is to be volatile and unpredictable.
Well, thank you, Dr. Illouz. That was quite an extraordinary, not just specification, but really an entire, very compelling account, not only what Israel's society is like in a structural sense, but also the ways in which the kinds of movements of forces in that society are both the central question, and yet, as you say, very hard to see how in that complex system they will play out. So with that in mind, and that's a kind of caveat, I think, for the rest of our discussion, now I'll ask you the question that I think brings us all here, and that we framed as the question, but we now know is incredibly hard for anyone, even yourself, to parse, which is, how would you begin to characterize the impacts of the October 7th massacre on Israeli society, polity, political culture, and psyche, and how the ongoing war in Gaza, take any of these that in relationship as you see appropriate?
So I'm going to use the word that I swore to myself to never use in my scholarship. But it is the first time I find that I cannot do without the word. And that word is trauma. So I think we should understand the notion of trauma. Sociologically, it marks a fundamental rupture. It is an event by which an individual or group thinks there is a before and there is an after. And I don't know how it appears to people outside of Israel, but I can assure you that this is how Israelis experience this event. It is an event which profoundly transforms collective consciousness and identity itself. For example, the Shoah was a traumatic event because it forever, I think, changed the ways in which Jews conceive of themselves, of their place in the world, and think about their history. And October 7th transformed and traumatized the Israeli psyche in a fundamental way. So let me just say why. After 67, the narrative of vulnerability changed into a narrative of force, which slowly morphed into a narrative of supremacy. And I would say that this narrative of supremacy was always in the background, but with Netanyahu and his coalition, it moved to the foreground. this camp was extremely sure of itself. You know, the Abraham Accords, for example, we can talk about this later. Also, the idea that you could make peace with some Arab states with whom there was no diplomatic relationship, the fact that Israel was giddy on its economic success, gave an incredible feeling of strength, and I would say almost invulnerability. So much so that the idea that Hamas fighters could penetrate and violate the border was simply unthinkable. So I would say that to start parsing out this broad characterization, I would say that most people like me have been involved with what I would call the politics of the present. We were very busy with the occupation, with the extreme right, and Israelis actually don't occupy themselves. Maybe you will not like hearing this, but they don't occupy themselves that much with Jewish history. And October 7th marked the eruption of the past. It connected Israel to a history it had not only put behind, but actually it thought it had vanquished. And it propelled this history in a way that was very shocking, since Israel was supposed to be the response to anti-Semitism. But then it turned out that French or American Jews were far more secure than Israeli Jews were. So that put, if you want, a kind of fundamental question mark around the very project of Zionism. So that is a kind of very fundamental, that's what I want to say. The very ground on which you stood before opened up for many Israelis. And this was all the more ironic and poignant that the stupefying explosions of anti-Jewish hatred in expected and non-expected places made the existence of Israel suddenly appear as more necessary to many people who had not thought so much of Israel until then. I'm talking about the Jews outside of Israel, or even some post-Zionist Jews inside Israel. So Israel is in a position of, it has now a self-perception of tremendous vulnerability, when it is, in fact, it remains a superpower, technological, economic, military. I don't know for how long, but it is still a superpower. And I think, so by the way, I would say in parentheses that the discrepancy is very dangerous. If you feel yourself extremely weak and vulnerable, but you are actually a superpower and cultivate the power, it can make you incredibly oblivious to the destruction that you inflict on others. But so I think the fundamental breach is around notions of strength and vulnerability. And I would say that we have moved to a sense of existential threat that has never existed before in Israel, because it exists on three different fronts. And when I say existential threat, I mean something, you need a kind of effort of imagination, because I think that no French or no American can really understand what I mean by that. Israelis really feel with and live with a feeling they can disappear. And that has happened before in the past. But the reason why this existential threat is new is that because it has three fronts. The first front is a military front, and it comes from at least 6 sources. the Hezbollah in the north, the Hamas, the West Bank Palestinians, the Houthis in Yemen, Iran, and Syria. So I would say that the circle of Israeli enemies has widened, and they have become actually much better and much better organized and much better armed. And they are now a part of a larger geopolitical shift binding Iran, Russia, and China, all of which aim to destabilize the Western world and Israel in particular. And we tend to forget the geopolitics of Putin and China when we speak of Israel, but it is very much there. And the fact that Israel is a regional power and that is still enjoying the support of the United States, and that it exercises a real and brutal colonial domination over Palestinians is not, I think, sufficient to reassure them about the fact that powerful Shiite and Sunni enemies have become extremely good strategists, and they are very determined to seriously harm Israel, and if possible, even to eliminate it altogether. The second existential threat is internal, and it is no less frightening than the external, and it has many fronts. One is a large contingent of power-hungry Jewish messianists who want to expel Palestinians out of Israel. They have actually spoken in a fairly overt way about a second Nakba. And these same people view the children of the secular pioneers of Israel, those who led to the creation of modern Israel, as traitors. And they want to impose a Jewish supremacist regime. And to do that, they intend to destroy Israeli democracy. And this camp has proven in the past that they know one thing or two about violence, since this is the same camp that actually murdered Yitzhak Rabin, and Ben Gvir himself has showed many times his proclivity for violence. The second domestic front that is threatening Israel from inside is the ever-growing population of ultra-Orthodox who enjoy feudal-like privileges. They do not work by choice, and they are supported by taxpayer-funded allowances. They do not serve in the army, and they are represented by political parties that have nothing to do with democracy or democratic values. And this group enjoys enormous privileges, again, that have no equivalent in the world. And I would add, the majority of them are anti-democratic. And therefore, they find themselves in a political alliance with Messianists. And I think both groups would be quite happy to see a theocratic state in Israel. And the final front of this internal political threat is made up of what I call Bibists. Now, I think Bibism is a doctrine. It is a right-wing doctrine centered around the cult of one man. It has happened before in the dark chapters of history. Masses can be hypnotized by a malevolent political figure and be in denial about his ruthlessness, although I think there is much less denial now. But Netanyahu has kidnapped the state for his political interests. And for example, he ignored the security warnings in order to pursue the same reforms which were actually threatening the security of Israel. And I would say the third threat is the most difficult to describe. And it is, it is a kind of collapse of faith in technology. Israelis have an incredible, I think, of all the people I know in the world, Israelis is the people who has the most faith in technology. And they had this super sophisticated barrier to stop any penetration of the border that collapsed. the faith in the army collapsed as well. It took the army an extremely long time to come and rescue the civilians. There was a collapse of the intelligence. And I would say there was also a much more general collapse of the state, who was absolutely unable to take care of the hundreds of thousands of people who were evacuated from the north and from the south. So what I want to say is that this was not a Yom Kippur, a kind of lapse or mistake. What happened on October 7th and after is what I would call, at least it is perceived this way, it was a systemic collapse. And it is a realization then that Israel is threatened from inside and outside. And this is exactly what is, I think, unprecedented. So I guess this gives you maybe a sense of the mood in Israel right now.
Yet again, that's incredibly helpful and gives us a lot to think about. I wonder, it might be that the questions I thought to follow up on are really, in some sense, already entailed in your answer, but I'll ask nonetheless. I wondered if first, and I'll combine these questions, because they're both about the war itself, the war in Gaza itself. First, is the war itself, in any of its dimensions, shaping or reshaping the Israeli social field, the social imaginary? Many Israelis, of course, are participating in the war in various ways. It's a mobilized society. The question of the faith in the army is at stake not only in Gaza, but also on the northern border. And then, of course, there's this amazing recent datum that a fifth of the Israeli population, meaning as many as a quarter of its Jews, think that the Israeli centrist and left elements were involved somehow in the Hamas attack. And then finally, and this is a sort of separate question unto itself, it seems clear to many that many Jewish Israelis tend to ignore, to downplay the sufferings of Gaza's civilian population. A variety of things are said. They brought the calamity on themselves. They're human shields. There's some evidence that Israeli media just doesn't center reportage around the suffering Gaza civilians and tends to treat that in the context of Hamas propaganda. And so the question related to the war is, how do you understand Israeli views of Gaza as a political sociologist?
So I think that's a very important question. Thank you. And you're right to raise it. I think I would say in the best case, there is what I would call an indifference of Israelis to the horrific death toll in Gaza. And I think there are many reasons. One is that research in social psychology shows that compassion is much less likely to emerge if you view the person who suffers as responsible for her suffering. You know, you smoked all your life, you have lung cancer, probably you deserve it somewhere. So I think that most Israelis believe that most Palestinians identify with Hamas. This is something that is unfortunately backed up by the data we have, as 60% of Palestinians do identify with Hamas. And given that Hamas has perpetrated atrocities on Israeli soil, so it is not only the sense of their territorial integrity that has been violated, but the fundamental, as I said, sense of security and even meaning of Zionism and Israel itself. And so Hamas is now demonized because it has shaken to the core Israeli sense of security, and Palestinians are viewed as extensions of Hamas. A second reason is that Israel has often behaved according to a security doctrine which has demanded that they overreact in order to deter and dissuade the other side from repeating the attacks. This has been a central tenet of Israeli military policy, and it's called the Dahiya doctrine, which dictates the use of overwhelming and disproportionate force and the targeting of government and civilian infrastructure during military operations. It received, by the way, the name of Dahia because this was a neighborhood in Beirut, which was a stronghold of the militia of Hezbollah, which Israel destroyed almost completely during its assault on Lebanon in the summer of 2006. So that means that, if you want, Israelis have become desensitized to the view that their response exacts a very high price in life, because they view this as the only way to deter the enemy from repeating its actions. Now, a third reason, I think, is that for the last 2 or more decades, the relationship to Palestinians has profoundly changed. First of all, there are many less interactions with Palestinians, very different from the Israel of the 1970s and 80s, where you could go freely to eat hummus in Ramallah and come back to Jerusalem in the evening. It's very, very different now. The Palestinians are out of sight. We know also from research on social psychology that it's much more easy to stereotype people you have no interactions with. But also, I would add that Israelis interact with Palestinians mostly in situations where they are prisoners or as workers, most of the time in menial jobs. And so that means that they interact with them in situation of domination. And domination is a very powerful, I think, way to dehumanize others. And finally, I would also add to this, do not forget that Israelis have, I'm not sure what the numbers are exactly today, but they had close to 200,000 people evacuated from the north and from the south, from 105 communities. That is a lot. That is putting incredible pressure on on Israel. That means, so 2 things. One is that objectively, the borders of Israel have narrowed. I mean, the extreme right can boast as much as it wants that it's going to reconquer Gaza. De facto, Israel's borders have considerably diminished because a large percentage of those people already said they will not go back to their settlements in the north and in the south. Add to this that they're still bombed. And so it is very difficult, I think, to think of others when you still feel under attack and when you have to care for a population, a large amount of population that is actually homeless. And when the Hamas has repeatedly said it will repeat over and over again its attacks. So you see, there are many reasons. It's really, it would be very difficult to imagine a highly compassionate response in these circumstances.
Well, you've already warned us about the incredible difficulty of making any kind of predictive sociological account of where any of this is going. But I think everyone's so desperate to know that maybe you'll at least take a stab. Do you have any sense, or how would you begin to answer the question of how or whether the October 7th attack and the war might alter Israel's political landscape in any meaningful way, right? In some ways, it's been a very stable political landscape. Parties have come and gone, but the right-wing coalition with its mix of national religious and Orthodox parties, the kind of decline of the left, the consolidation of a sort of centrist anti-Netanyahu site, an Israeli Arab or Israeli Palestinian voter population that is structurally opposed to the right, obviously, but also often very detached from, or in some ways distanced from, the political scene. And that seems to be true already for 20, 30 years. So is there any way we can see any kind, or things that strike you as interesting, perhaps indications of any kind of political reorientation in that fairly stable landscape?
I think the only thing I can say right now, I'm not really a political analyst, but the thing we can say, I can say, I think with a great deal of certainty right now, is that there is a huge disappointment and anger at Netanyahu from his own constituency. Of course, I would not mention that from the opposite constituency, that's obvious. And at the same time, there is an endorsement of extreme right-wing policies. So you have this kind of, if you want, dissociation of the right-wing field between the adoption of extreme right policies and the fact that Bibi Netanyahu was the one that embodied them. But now think about the alternative. Imagining, in the best case scenario, imagine that Netanyahu goes home soon. And so what seems to be in the cards would be that Gantz would be in his National Unity Party would lead the government. But, you know, this party is neither left-wing, of course, it's not even centrist. Gantz is really right-wing, and Saar is really, really right-wing. I remind you that Gantz criticized Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to bar US Congresswomen Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib from entering Israel. He said that Omar and Tlaib would have seen that the West Bank is, I quote, the second best place for Arabs in the Middle East. He was talking about the territories. So I think that even if Netanyahu actually evacuates the political field, which is far from being certain, you will have, for sure, a majority of people in the right. I also remind you that in 2022, there had been already a massive shift to the right. In 2022, there was a poll where 62% had declared they were they identified with the right, with the left having virtually completely disappeared. And so if in 2022 it was 62%, I would venture to say it's probably today 75% or maybe even 80% of people identifying today with the policies of the right. When I say the right, I don't mean, I don't mean the civilized right. I mean probably a mixture of people who are easier to talk to and a very extreme right-wing factions.
A follow-up to that question and to that rather bracing answer might point us to a very important work that you did right before it came out some months before the October 7th attack and the ensuing war. And that's your work of political sociological analysis, or called The Emotional Life of Populism. And at the heart of that book, which is not just about the Israeli situation, but has a lot to say about it, was the question of how exactly the nationalist populist right in Israel, as embodied in Netanyahu's successive governments, how it's been so successful over the past 20 years or so in winning and holding this fairly stable, if not growing, part of the Jewish population. And you emphasize the right's sort of savvy and ability in the sphere of emotional mobilization, right? The way a whole right-wing political, religious, and media ecosystem has worked very successfully to mobilize what you call sort of 4 key affective areas: fear, disgust, resentment, and love. And do you think October 7th might lead in any way to a kind of reorganization of this emotional landscape and its political consequences?
Thank you for bringing up this book, in which I really tried to map the effective politics of Netanyahu. And I argued in it that there are 4 major emotional narratives, intertwined emotional narratives, that explain the grip that Netanyahu had on the Israeli psyche. One was fear, with Netanyahu having been a kind of consummate virtuoso artist in the art of instilling fear. The second being disgust, which was about the kind of small ideological revolution which happened in Israel after Kahana, Mayor Kahana, who was a Jewish extremist, who was banned from the Knesset, which has been taken up by a variety of social actors, such as rabbis in the occupied territories, but also all kinds of NGOs, for example, whose aim is to prevent the marriage between Jews and non-Jews, especially Arabs. And I call them the entrepreneur of disgust, because they successfully put together various groups such as Arabs, feminist women, homosexual, leftists, and characterized them as venom, stench, garbage, and so on and so forth. The third emotion, which in my book is absolutely central and crucial to understand the holding grip of the Likud on the Mizrahi electoral constituency, was the emotion of resentment, which actually built on the real deep discrimination and even segregation of the Mizrahim from the Ashkenazi control of society. And this, I think, Begin started this, but Netanyahu was again a master at fostering this politics of the rumination. The resentment is not only a politics of victimhood, but it is a politics that ruminates constantly about victimhood. And Netanyahu, who is perfectly Ashkenazi, became the king of this electoral constituency. And love was about the change in patriotism. There are 2 forms, if you want, of patriotism: inclusionary and exclusionary. Inclusionary patriotism would be the French patriotism, which really welcomed many foreigners and pushed the Jews inside the polity in the 18th and 19th century. And exclusionary patriotism, I think, is very much strengthened by religion. And so we are witnessing religious nationalism. By the way, I think in America as well, there is now a brand of religious nationalism that is very dangerous. So to go back to your question, I would say that fear is, in my book, I make a distinction between imaginary fear and real fear. I think it would be more difficult to make this distinction today. The fear of the enemy is no longer imagined and far away. It's not the Iranian demon. The enemy has taken on a kind of tangibility and reality that would make me change my analysis there. I think fear, disgust, and love are extremely powerful today, with disgust because the Hamas has been Nazified. There has always been a Nazification here and there of the Palestinians, but I think here it is much more upfront, and that the Nazification of the Hamas means that the conflict for many is radicalized, And love is because I think has been also very much strengthened because the boundaries of the Jewish group have very much increased vis-a-vis the Israeli Arabs. And there is a poll that suggests that the relationship between Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis have become very strained. 21% of Arabs are worried about being attacked by Jews. And among Jewish citizens, 51% are worried about being attacked by Arab Israelis. And by the way, this has led to an intense militarization of Israeli society. That is, not only will the military become at the center, it tended to become less important. I think the high tech was the dominant social force in Israel for the last decade or so. I think the military is now making a big comeback, but also people are arming themselves. And, we don't have exactly an NRA in Israel, but it is very close to that, with private citizens actually purchasing a lot of weapons. So I would say that the sense of enmity with Arab Israelis and the closing up of the Jewish boundaries have hardened. Yeah.
We have a few more minutes. I'm going to invite our listeners to send questions. Please send them to me in the chat, and I can mediate those. And I'm going to, and while I'm waiting for folks to gather their questions, with so many more things I could ask, and I hope our people will, but let me ask you, Eva, turn our attention briefly to a different part of the sort of global scene. You've been a participant observer and a forceful commentator on what we might call the post-colonial left's discourse about the October 7th attack and the Gaza war and the larger context of both. So what have you been seeing and how do you understand it? What are the underlying factors in your view that lead to these formulations? And what would you want us to know as we think about those, that world of discourse?
You mean about the reactions of the global left?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to say that this was quite shocking to me. Personally, because I identify, this is my camp. This is the camp I normally identify with. And it was quite shocking because I used to think of crimes against humanity as events, or maybe the last events, capable of creating moral communities. Because, I thought horror has a kind of brutal objectivity which can neutralize the plurality of opinions and ideological differences. And I also thought that the political sensibility that was most likely to be revolted by atrocities was my camp, that is the left camp. The left is the camp of compassion. And they are often even derided by conservatives exactly for that reason. But the opposite was true here. A good part of the international left actually either celebrated the news of the massacre as an act of resistance against the colonizer, or ignored it, or dismissed it. I'll just give you an example. On Sunday, I think October 8th, there was a rally in Manhattan, and Bret Stephens, conservative columnist of the New York Times, attended the rally. And he said he looked even for perfunctory expressions of sorrow or empathy, and he said there was none to be found. Instead, what he saw was, I quote, giddiness and gloating. And this was far from being the only occasion. This repeated itself in America, in France, etc. So this is, for me, beyond ideological position, because of course you can be against the occupation, as I am, and yet show compassion for the atrocity and the butchery. But this is not what happened. So as to your question, why that is, I'll go very, very fast. I would say the two main reasons. One is that I think there is a powerful ideological and political alliance between the left Black movements and defenders of Muslim minorities. And I consider it as a profound tragedy that while Jews had been involved and deeply involved in the 1960s and 70s and even 80s in the struggle against racism with both African Americans and Arabs in France, for example, the Jews became slowly excluded from these struggles, or anti-Semitism actually became excluded from the struggle against racism. And so, this deserves, of course, a much more careful unpacking than I can provide here. And I would say the second reason, let's be honest, is the appalling policy of Israel under Netanyahu, which has disregarded international law and has made the notion of apartheid plausible to understand the occupation. And you can, in a way, understand why this notion of apartheid would be completely unacceptable to many members of the African American community. And let me add to this that Netanyahu himself, taunted Barack Obama publicly and humiliated him when he went to Congress. So I think Israel itself is responsible for the very negative image, but this, of course, does not mean that it justifies the level of demonization, the completely disproportionate level of demonization that it has been the object of.
Thank you. So we have several questions, and of course, you've already given us so much time, so we'll see what we can do. One question turns us back, some of the questions turn us back inside Israel. First, do the terms and tools for thinking that you put forward in your work help us think about the struggle within Israeli society over how to represent or understand what happened on October 7th? For instance, the very emotional confrontations between different families of kidnappees representing different sectors, or if you feel like touching on this very troubling question, the ways that sexual violence on October 7th has and has not been discussed and thought about. So can you help us think about the ways in which Israelis are processing or not processing October 7th through the lens of some of this work on affect and emotional landscape?
I'm not sure I can, but let me tell you the notion that comes to mind. Lacan, the psychoanalyst Lacan, I never use normally psychoanalysis in my work, but Lacan has a notion which he calls the real, and he opposes it to the unconscious and the symbolic, which are made of fantasies and dreams and hallucinations. And the real in Lacan is reality in its raw, unmediated form. It is what disrupts the subject's received notions about himself and about the world around him. And it is a kind of complete shattering of the subject. That's how Lacan thought of the real. And so when you encounter the real for Lacan, you really have to find new signifiers, new meanings. So I would say that the work I did before was about highly, I would say, codified and fictional emotional constructs, highly codified emotional narratives. What we have now is this eruption of the real, which in a way shatters these narrative constructions. So that's one thing that comes to mind answering this question. The second thing that comes to mind to make sense of what is the horrific sexual violence and the reality of those homeless Israelis in Israel is a notion that Arendt discusses very quickly in her Origins of Totalitarianism. She speaks about desperate hope And she says something like, something like desperate hope and desperate fear often seem closer to the center on, events that are that are catastrophic than balanced judgment and rational insight. And I think that desperate hope and desperate fear is exactly what Israelis are at right now. I would also add an additional, less pleasant dimension, but I would say that vengeance, which is an idea that we want to expel out of our moral and legal vocabulary, is also highly present in the psyche, in trying to respond to this. But I don't think that vengeance is understandable as a first reaction. It can never substitute for politics or for legal institutions.
As we've known since Aeschylus, but it seems easy to forget and hard to remember. Yeah, you've broached these questions of how to use psychological categories for thinking about these terribly important questions. Another questioner asks, might there emerge over time a sense of moral trauma among Israelis as they come to grips with the damage done to civilians in Gaza after October 7th? Perhaps you've already answered that by speaking about the power of feelings of vengeance, but maybe you would like to address that further.
It's a very good question. I think it all depends on the political culture that will emerge after these events. I think if we are able to renew and build again a democratic polity with humanist values, that will possibly emerge. But what is possible, and I'm saying this only as a possibility, what Israel may perhaps illustrate is that you cannot have maybe a military and democracy at the same time. And that, in fact, a country that is objectively threatened and objectively preoccupied by constant security is, in the long term and in the short term as well, incompatible with democratic culture and polity. We don't know yet. We are in the middle of this vast experiment that is called Zionism. But that could be, in fact, if there is no such moral trauma that emerges, that would have been because democracy was not able to regain its footing.
Professor Illouz, this has been incredibly illuminating. I don't think it's particularly happy making, but it's been very illuminating, and I know that I'll be using this in my classes, and I'm pleased that people who missed the actual event will be able to return to this for guidance. There's so much more to say and so much more to ask, but you've been so generous with your time. Is there a last dimension of any of this very complex matter you've laid out so compellingly that you feel you'd like to address as we close the session today?
So maybe I would like to, we didn't talk about this because we could not talk about everything, but there is something I would like to maybe mention, and which is the extraordinary disappearance of the left in the Israeli society. And it is really a tragedy how much the left, which could have been an opposition to Netanyahu, has not been able to effectively counter what was about to happen. The reasons are many. It was because Netanyahu managed to successfully delegitimize them by calling them traitors. And many people believe this today. We have to say that the left was extraordinarily incompetent and did not manage to have successful leaders. And it was incompetent, among others, because it made the Palestinian issue disappear. This started more than 20 years ago with one of the Labour Party leader, Sheli Yachimovich, and it was continued by Gabay and by Merav Michaeli, and they simply abandoned the Palestinian issue. And they also made very meek and grotesque attempts to appeal to Mizrahim when they, in fact, they were exclusively Ashkenazi party. And so the left in Israel became, in fact, a neoliberal left, which was much more, which had much more to do with the high-tech sector than with the working class. It had nothing to do, in fact, with the working class. And it was unable, in a way, to really address the two main issues of Israeli society, which is the class divide, which enabled the Likud to hold captive the Mizrahim, who are the majority, who hold them captive for so long, and it was unable to address the occupation, which should really have been morally its object. So I think there is a very serious, how do you say, a very serious process of self-examination that the left should do with itself. And also, you know, I think we did not mention the fact that, and it reflects the same mood. It was the Abraham Accords, which we all celebrated, but which turned out to have been the outcome of an incredible blindness on the side of from Americans and Israeli diplomacy, by, you know, thinking you could just make the Palestinian issue disappear if simply you did not think about it or talked about it. And so the last thing I want to say is that the secular Fatah and the secular Israelis, have been both incredibly weakened by their extremists. And so this is a case where moderation lost in a way. And so we should be, I think, passionately moderate. If, you know, that would be maybe my call for reconstructing a left, which would be to be passionately moderate in our vision of peace.
Thank you, Dr. Illouz. Please join me in thanking Dr. Illouz for this profoundly illuminating discussion.